The vintage clothing market in the UK has changed dramatically in recent years. Once considered niche, vintage fashion now influences mainstream wardrobes, designer collections, and online shopping habits. Furthermore, shoppers increasingly value individuality, affordability, and sustainable fashion choices. Vintage clothing offers all three benefits. A carefully chosen vintage jacket can outlast several modern alternatives. A second-hand dress can also create a distinctive outfit without following seasonal trends. Moreover, buying pre-owned clothing keeps existing garments in circulation for longer. This approach supports a slower, more thoughtful relationship with fashion. London remains one of Britain's most influential vintage shopping destinations. However, the market now extends far beyond specialist boutiques. Consumers can discover vintage clothing through charity shops, kilo sales, online marketplaces, and curated websites. Consequently, vintage fashion has become more accessible than ever. This guide explains the vintage clothing market UK in clear terms. It explores the market's definition, history, sustainability benefits, and future trends, offering practical advice for building a lasting wardrobe. What is vintage clothing? Vintage clothing usually describes garments produced at least 20 years ago. Therefore, clothing from the 1990s and early 2000s can now qualify as vintage. However, age alone does not always determine a garment's value. Design, quality, rarity, condition, brand, and cultural importance also influence desirability. Vintage clothing differs from antique clothing. Antique garments are generally much older and often date from before the 20th century. Meanwhile, second-hand clothing refers to any previously owned garment. A vintage item normally reflects a recognizable historical period. The term retro describes newer clothing inspired by older styles. A modern brand might produce a 70s-inspired dress that is retro, not vintage. Vintage, second-hand, and pre-loved, these terms often overlap. Vintage focuses on age, period, and design history. For shoppers, the important distinction involves quality and authenticity. A genuine vintage garment may feature older fabrics and construction methods. Therefore, buyers should examine garments carefully. Look for original labels, fabric composition, and care instructions to identify age. The history of vintage fashion in Britain. Second-hand clothing has existed for centuries. People historically repaired and inherited clothing. The 1960s transformed British fashion. London became an important centre for experimental style, using historic garments to create individual looks. Charity shops became central to the UK market. The 80s introduced bold shoulders, while the 90s brought minimalism and slip dresses. The UK second-hand market has grown substantially. Shoppers want unique designs and sustainability, aided by platforms like Vinted and Depop. Buying vintage reduces textile waste. However, the most sustainable garment is the one that gets worn. Ultimately, vintage fashion is about giving existing garments a longer, more meaningful life.